Dawn crawled gently across the canyons, brushing gold over the bones of the desert. Wind whispered through sage and brittle grass, carrying the scent of rain long gone. Somewhere far below, a raven circled above a lonely rider. Jonas Hale, his shape a moving speck against the endless cliffs. They said the land could swallow a man's heart whole, and maybe it had swallowed his. He rode like one who no longer expected to arrive anywhere. The hooves of his weary mare echoed off the canyon walls, fading into the hush of morning. Jonas was searching for a stray calf that had wandered off after the storm, but truth was, he needed the quiet more than the animal. Out here, among the rocks and wind, he could forget the hollow echo of his ranch, the silence where laughter used to live. Then came the sound, faint but sharp, a cry that didn't belong to cattle. He froze, the reins slack in his calloused hand. Another cry, strained and ragged, cut through the air like torn cloth. He followed the sound around a bend where the canyon narrowed to a throat of stone. There, tangled in barbed wire and desperation, was a Mustang, a silver-gray stallion, muscles trembling, flanks bleeding where metal bit deep. Its eyes, wild and rimmed with fear, met his. Jonas dismounted slowly, moving with the caution of a man approaching a wounded god. "Easy now," he whispered, voice low and cracked from years of dust. He knelt beside the beast, pulling his knife from his belt. Each flick of the blade freed a little more of the stallion, but also tore at his own palms. When the final wire snapped, the Mustang lurched upright, legs shaking. For a moment it stood there, breathing hard, blood running down its side, eyes locked on Jonas. Then, with one swift toss of its mane, it turned and disappeared into the sunrise. Jonas watched until even the sound of its hooves faded. Then he looked down at his bloodied hands and smiled faintly. The first honest expression to cross his face in months. He returned home by mid-morning. His ranch lay sprawled across the valley like a memory too stubborn to fade. The barn leaned to one side, the fences were gray with age, and the house carried the quiet ache of a place left behind by time. Inside, dust lay thick on the table. He poured himself a cup of cold coffee and stared at the chair across from him. Her chair. Lydia's. His wife had been gone 6 years, taken by a fever that winter couldn't shake. Since then, words had left him. Only the rhythm of chores remained, feeding, mending, waiting. The neighbors called him the Hollow Man. Some said he talked to ghosts. Maybe he did. He rode into town once a week, more from habit than need. Folks would nod politely, though some avoided his gaze. At Doone's general store, Clara Doone, a widow herself, would hand him his sack of flour or coffee beans with soft, deliberate care. "Everything all right out at the ranch, Mr. Hale?" she'd ask, her voice quiet as cotton drifting through air. He'd nod. Can't complain. But when her fingers brushed his, something unspoken lingered, like the faint warmth of a sunbeam on cold wood. Outside, he'd hear whispers carried by porch talk. "That Hale fella's cursed. Talks to the wind, that one. Still wearing that same hat she gave him." He never replied. Shame was a familiar weight. It didn't hurt anymore, only bent him in the middle like an old nail. One Saturday, as the town gathered for the autumn fair, Jonas stood at the edge of the crowd, feeling like a ghost drifting through laughter. Children ran past with paper flags. Fiddles played near the livery. Clara spotted him and offered a soft smile, but he couldn't bring himself to step closer. Then a voice behind him. Deputy Ross Mercer, firm but not unkind. "Jonas, I hear the bank's fixin' to claim your north field. You ought to sell while it's worth something." Jonas didn't answer. He just stared past the deputy toward the far ridge where the sky burned orange. Ross sighed. "You can't live off ghosts, Hale." Jonas turned then, his eyes hard as flint. "Ain't ghosts I'm living off, Ross. It's promises." That night he sat beside the cold hearth, his hat clutched between his hands. The house creaked softly, wood settling into sorrow. "Ain't much left of me, Lydia," he murmured. "Not sure what I'm keeping alive for." Outside, wind moved across the grass like the breath of something ancient and forgiving. A few days later, He found tracks near the western fence, deep, deliberate prints in the dust. Too large for cattle, too straight for stray horses. He followed them to the ridge where sagebrush grew thick. At sunset, as the sky bled gold and violet, he saw it, the Mustang, the same silver stallion, healed and whole, its coat gleaming in the fading light. It stood at a distance, motionless, watching him. Jonas's throat tightened. He took off his hat, feeling the desert wind lift through his hair. They stayed like that, man and beast, two broken souls staring across the gulf of time. Jonas felt something in his chest shift, something quiet and forgotten, like a rusted hinge easing open. The stallion stamped once, snorted, and turned. With a toss of its mane, it galloped into the horizon, hooves striking sparks of light from the stone. Jonas stood there long after it vanished, his heart thudding with a strange mix of awe and sorrow. That night, he couldn't sleep. He dreamt of open plains and rolling thunder, of a sky wide enough to forgive anything. When morning came, he saddled his mare and rode east, not for cattle, not for duty, but for the feeling of wind against his face. He hadn't done that in years. The land stretched out before him, vast and alive, painted in the soft tones of dawn. In the distance, he thought he saw a flash of silver, just a glimmer. Then it was gone. But it was enough. For the first time in a long while, Jonas Hale smiled into the wind. Autumn folded into winter, and with it came a deepening silence. The ranch creaked under frost and loneliness. Jonas Hale patched fences and shoveled snow from his roof, each motion slow, deliberate, almost reverent, as if keeping busy could keep sorrow from settling too deep. Some nights, he'd step outside beneath a sky heavy with stars. The land would glow faintly in moonlight, and he'd listen, not for wolves or wind, but for hoofbeats that no longer came. Still, he kept a lantern burning in the window. In case he ever wanders back, he'd murmur to himself, half smiling. But months passed, and only the coyotes answered. Then came the storm. It arrived like the devil himself, dragging thunder through the sky. Lightning clawed across the horizon. Jonas was out checking the fence line when the first strike hit the ridge, lighting the canyon in an orange roar. Within minutes, the wind turned fierce, pushing walls of fire through the dry grass. The air filled with smoke and the screams of frightened cattle. Jonas spurred his mare toward the barn. Flames leapt the fence like wild dogs. His eyes stung, his throat burned. Inside the barn, the horses kicked and screamed. He threw open their stalls, slapping their rumps to drive them out. One beam cracked overhead. A groaning sound, long and low, then splintered, crashing down. Jonas dove aside, but his leg caught beneath a burning plank. Pain flared white-hot. He clawed at the dirt, coughing, eyes watering. The smoke grew thick. Heat pressed against him like a living thing. He tried to crawl, but his strength bled out fast. He thought of Lydia, of the last words she'd spoken, her hand on his cheek. "You'll be all right." "Jonas, you always were." Then the world blurred. He thought he saw movement through the smoke, a figure, tall and spectral, moving toward him. He blinked hard. Not human. It was a horse, a silver ghost tearing through the smoke. Ash fire. The stallion screamed, a wild, haunting cry that cut through the roar of fire. Jonas could barely lift his head as the animal lunged forward, hooves striking sparks. The stallion kicked away the burning beam, teeth gripping Jonas's coat, pulling him inch by inch toward the open air. The sky above was red, the world a storm of ash. Jonas's vision dimmed, but he heard the thunder of hooves and felt the earth tremble beneath them. Then suddenly a cold. The clean sting of rain. He gasped for breath as darkness swallowed him whole. When Jonas opened his eyes, the world was gray and quiet. The storm had passed. Charred wood smoked around him. He lay wrapped in a blanket on damp earth, his leg bound in linen. A soft voice broke through the haze. "You're lucky I found you when I did." Clara Doone sat beside him, hair undone, eyes rimmed with worry. Behind her, the remains of the barn smoldered. Jonas tried to sit, grimacing. The horses? All but two made it, she hesitated. And there were tracks. Not your mare's. Larger. Wilder. Her gaze met his. What kind of horse pulls a man out of fire, Jonas? He didn't answer, only turned his head toward the open field where smoke curled into morning light. For days, Clara stayed. She nursed his burns, changed the bandages, and made him tea that smelled faintly of mint and rain. She spoke little, only humming sometimes while she worked. The quiet between them grew soft, almost sacred. At night, when pain stole his sleep, Jonas would whisper, "You should have seen him, Clara. Silver as the moon." Eyes like they remembered everything. She'd smile faintly. "Then maybe the world's not done with you yet." Something inside him, something long buried, stirred. He began to rebuild plank by plank with her at his side. The laughter of a woman's voice, long absent from his land, found its way back into the air. Weeks passed. The scars on his leg faded from purple to pale white. Spring came, painting the hills with wild flowers. The ranch breathed again. One morning, as he mended the last of the fences, Clara rode up from town, hat tilted against the sun. She carried a basket of bread and letters, her smile easy and real. "You're starting to look like a man with something to live for," she teased. He grinned, slow and uncertain. "Maybe I am." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky turn gold, Clara reached over and rested her hand atop his. It was a small gesture, but to Jonas it felt like a promise, one born not of words, but of shared silence. When she left for town, Jonas saddled his mare and followed the tracks that had haunted his dreams since the fire. He rode west, past the canyon ridge where the land split open like a wound. The air was thick with the scent of new grass and rain. Somewhere ahead, a wild call echoed. Fierce, beautiful. He dismounted near the same rocky ledge where he'd freed the Mustang months ago. The wind shifted, carrying dust and memory. Then from the mouth of the canyon they came, a herd of Mustangs thundering through sunlight. Their coats gleamed bronze, chestnut, and gray, manes flowing like smoke, and at their head, ash fire. The stallion slowed when he saw Jonas. The herd fanned out behind him, restless but calm. Jonas took off his hat, heart pounding like a drum. "I reckon you don't owe me nothing," he said softly. "But thank you anyway." Ashfire stepped closer, nostrils flaring. For one breathless moment, they stood within reach, man and beast, bound by something older than words. Jonas reached out his hand, not to claim, but to honor. The stallion bowed his head briefly, a gesture that felt almost human, then turned toward the horizon. He galloped away, his herd following, their silhouettes swallowed by the glowing dust. Jonas stood long after they vanished, feeling the earth tremble beneath his boots, the air humming with the echo of hooves. For the first time in years, he didn't feel small beneath the sky. He felt part of it. By the time Jonas rode home, evening had settled. That golden hour when the land holds its breath. Clara waited on the porch, lantern glowing beside her. She smiled as he dismounted. "Find what you were looking for?" He nodded. Didn't find it. Remembered it. They stood in silence, the air sweet with spring. The wind moved gently across the grass, carrying laughter, ashes, forgiveness. Clara leaned against him, and together they watched the sun dip low, painting the world in gold. Years later, folks still told the story, how a wild stallion pulled a man from the fire, then vanished like smoke. Some called it nonsense. Others swore they saw a silver horse running the ridgeline when storms rolled in. Old men on bar stools would shake their heads and mutter, "Kindness don't die easy out here." And those who passed by Jonas's ranch would sometimes notice a lantern still burning by the window. Not for ghosts, but for remembrance. Because somewhere beyond the hills, under a wide western sky, freedom ran on four legs, and a man named Jonas Hale lived proof that mercy once given never fades. Out here, where the land remembers everything, kindness rides longer than a man's name. Sometimes what you set free comes back to save you. The wind carried the words like prayer, vanishing into twilight. The last light fell on the ranch, rebuilt, alive and loved, as a silver shadow flickered across the far ridge.